There is a photograph taken from the International Space Station in 2012. NASA released it. You have probably seen it. The blue marble. Earth at night, city lights scattered across continents like scattered embers, oceans dark, and what fills the spaces between? Green. Broad, dense, unbroken green across the northern latitudes, the equatorial belt, the slopes of every mountain range worth naming. You look at that image and you think, forest. You think ancient. You think deep. You think the world still has something primal left in it. What if none of that is true? Not in the way the conspiracy theorists mean it. Not a simulation. Not a hologram. Not a government secret. Something more disturbing than any of those, because it has a paper trail, because economists and foresters and timber lobbyists signed their names to it, because the transformation happened in plain sight across 2 centuries, and nobody thought to ask whether the thing that replaced the original was actually the same thing they claimed to be managing. The oldest living tree we have confirmed is a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California. It is approximately 5,000 years old. The Romans were building roads when it germinated. Mycenae was still standing. Written language was new. That tree existed before the concept of a forest as an economic resource had entered any human mind anywhere on Earth. Here is what we know about what existed before the timber economy. European oak forests before the medieval period grew trees with trunk diameters exceeding 2 meters. A single tree of that size represents 300 to 500 years of uninterrupted growth. The cathedral builders of the 12th and 13th centuries stripped those trees from entire river valleys to float them downstream to construction sites. What replaced them was not nothing. Replacement trees grew, but they were 100 years old where the originals were 400. 50 years old where the originals were 300. The canopy looked similar from a distance. The ecosystem was not the same thing. That distinction, the difference between a canopy and an ecosystem, between the appearance of a forest and the biological reality of one, is the thread this script follows. Because once you pull it, everything you think you know about how much natural world remains starts to unravel. The formal history of industrial forestry begins in Germany in the late 18th century. A Prussian mining official named Hans Carl von Carlowitz published a treatise in 1713, arguing that timber harvesting should not exceed timber regrowth. He called this Nachhaltigkeit, sustainability. The word entered the English language through forestry before it entered environmentalism by more than 2 centuries. Von Carlowitz was not an ecologist. He was an economist worried about the silver mines of Saxony running out of the wood they needed for pit props and smelting fuel. The concept he invented solved an industrial problem. It did not preserve forests. It replaced them with something that could be managed like a crop. The German state forests that emerged from his philosophy were geometric. Rows of a single species planted at intervals calculated to maximize timber yield per hectare per decade. The natural German forest had contained oak, beech, hornbeam, lime, wild service tree, field maple, dozens of species at varying ages, covering irregular terrain that no surveyor had ever formally classified. The managed German forest contained Norway spruce, in rows. This model was not controversial among the economists and administrators who built the 19th century world. It was celebrated. Gifford Pinchot, the American who became the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, under Theodore Roosevelt, trained in those German state forests. He brought the model back. The national forest system he built was not designed to preserve ancient growth. It was designed to prevent monopolization of timber supply, managed cutting rather than unmanaged cutting. The alternative was not no cutting. The alternative was the timber barons taking everything without supervision. Pinchot said this explicitly. He wrote that the object of forestry was not to preserve the forests for their own sake, but to produce the largest amount of whatever crop was most needed in the long run. The word he used was crop. Forests were crops. The mountains of the American West were farms. The fact that they contained organisms that had been alive since before Columbus arrived was an accounting detail, not a moral consideration. What followed from that logic is measurable. The United States had approximately 1 billion acres of old-growth forest when Europeans arrived. Today the estimate is somewhere between 5 and 8 million acres, less than 1% of the original. The rest was cut. What grew back, what the Forest Service calls forest, what the satellite images show as green, is second growth, third growth. In many places of the Pacific Northwest, fourth growth rotations have already begun. A second growth. Douglas fir stand in Oregon is not the same biological entity as the old growth forest it replaced. The old growth contained trees that were 800 years old. Their canopies were uneven, broken by centuries of individual tree death and regrowth, which created vertical complexity. Fallen logs in various stages of decay across the forest floor supported thousands of invertebrate species. The mycorrhizal networks connecting tree roots through fungal threads extended across entire hillsides, transferring carbon and water between trees, a communication and resource sharing system that takes centuries to develop fully. None of that infrastructure exists in a 50-year rotation plantation. The canopy is there, the green is there, the ancient biological machinery underneath it is not. The economists who designed this system did not believe they were lying. They were applying the best framework they had, which was the framework of agriculture. A forest is a slow farm. You plant, you wait, you harvest, you plant again. The fact that the waiting period is 50 years instead of one growing season is a logistical complication, not a categorical difference. From this perspective, the managed forests of the modern world are forests in exactly the same sense that a wheat field is a grassland. That is the argument. That is the one nobody states plainly because it destroys the entire public justification for the regulatory framework around timber harvesting. If what you are managing is not a forest but a tree plantation with a long rotation cycle, then the conservation laws protecting forests do not apply to it in any meaningful biological sense. And if those laws do not apply, then the public land designations that restrict development and mining and other extractive industries in forested zones are based on a categorical error. The green on the map is not what the law was written to protect, but it is what the industry points to when it argues that forests are being sustainably managed. This matters economically in ways that have nothing to do with ecology. The global timber industry generates approximately $600 billion in annual revenue. The carbon credit markets built on forest coverage assume that the trees being counted are equivalent to old growth in their carbon sequestration capacity. They are not. A 50-year Douglas fir stores a fraction of the carbon held by an 800-year tree. But in the accounting systems that determine carbon credit valuations, a hectare of certified managed forest counts as a hectare of forest. The financial instruments built on that equation are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. There is a specific moment when this accounting fiction became institutionalized. In 1992, at the Rio Earth Summit, nations agreed on a definition of forest that required a minimum canopy cover of 10% and a minimum height of 2 meters. The definition was designed to be inclusive, to allow developing nations with various vegetation types to participate in international forest conservation frameworks. But it also meant that a managed plantation of 6-year-old eucalyptus trees counted as forest under international law in exactly the same way that an undisturbed rainforest counted as forest. The eucalyptus was planted to make paper. It would be cut in another 6 years. Nobody who wrote that definition believed a eucalyptus plantation was equivalent to primary rainforest. But the definition they wrote does not distinguish between them. Brazil's national forest statistics include eucalyptus plantations. Chile counts pine monocultures established on land cleared of native forest. Canada counts aspen regrowth after clear cutting. The United States counts tree farms in the southeast that are replanted every 30 years. All of it is forest, all of it appears green on the satellite images NASA publishes, all of it supports the claim that forest coverage has remained relatively stable globally over the past several decades. It has not remained stable. What has remained stable is the appearance of coverage, which is not the same thing. The researchers who study this are not fringe voices. A 2015 study in Science found that the Earth has approximately 3 trillion trees. That number received enormous attention because it was larger than previous estimates. What received less attention was the study's finding that tree density had declined by 46% since the start of human civilization. Not since industrialization. Since the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago. Nearly half of all the trees that existed when humans started farming are gone. The 3 trillion number is what is left after a 10,000-year extraction. And within that remaining total, the proportion of old, complex, ecologically intact forest continues to decline. A 2020 paper in Science Advances found that only about 3% of Earth's land surface could be classified as ecologically intact, meaning it retained its full complement of native species at historically appropriate population densities and had experienced negligible human influence, 3%. The rest has been altered, simplified, or replaced. The most honest framing of this situation comes not from environmentalists, but from the economists who designed the system. William Nordhaus, the Yale economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for integrating climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis, built models that explicitly treated natural ecosystems as inputs to economic production. His models assumed that the economy could substitute for natural systems when those systems were degraded, that human capital and manufactured capital could replace natural capital. Those assumptions were contested by other economists from the beginning, but they became the foundation of the policy frameworks that governed forest management for most of the 20th century. The substitution assumption is the central intellectual error. It says that a managed plantation substitutes for an old growth forest in the same way that a steel bridge substitutes for a wooden one. Same function, different material. The biological evidence says this is false. The functions performed by an ecologically intact forest include water filtration across entire watersheds, soil formation across geological timescales, carbon sequestration in forms that persist for centuries, temperature regulation through transpiration and canopy shading, habitat for species whose ecosystem services we depend on and largely cannot enumerate. None of these functions are performed equivalently by a plantation. Many of them are not performed at all. When you fly over the Pacific Northwest, you see green. You see what looks like forest. What you are actually seeing is the 3rd or 4th generation of a tree crop planted on ground where the original forest stood. The ground itself has changed. The soil that formed over thousands of years under old growth is not the same soil that supports a plantation. The mycorrhizal networks are gone. The nurse logs are gone. The snag habitat for cavity nesting species is gone. The multi-layered canopy is gone. The understory species that depended on specific light conditions created by the original canopy are gone. What remains is the silhouette of a forest, the economic abstraction of a forest in the sense that the 1992 definition requires. The tuning fork in the British Library vibrates at a frequency nobody alive is fighting for. The ancient forests of Earth occupy land that governments and corporations have been managing as crop rotations for 2 centuries. The question is the same in both cases. When you look at what remains and you ask what was lost, the answer is not nothing visible. The answer is the infrastructure underneath, the complexity underneath, the biological machinery that took centuries to build and was replaced by something that looks similar but functions entirely differently. The satellite images show green. The green is real. The question nobody seems willing to ask is not whether the trees are there. The question is what kind of trees, how old, how complex, and whether the system they once constituted is still operating or whether we are looking at the ruins of a forest the way we might look at a Roman aqueduct. The stone is still there. The water stopped flowing centuries ago. We have the canopy. We have the statistics. We have the international agreements and the carbon credits and the sustainable forestry certifications. What we do not have is what existed before the timber economists decided that a crop with a long rotation cycle was the same thing as an ecosystem that had been accumulating complexity for 800 years. That knowledge walked out of the old growth with the last tree that was too large to be economically worth the cost of extraction. And the people who remembered what the original looked like are as gone as the forests themselves.